In my program yesterday, I said that in connection with the conflict in Ukraine, I got the sense that we might be coming to the end of the affair. And I have to say that more information that I've seen over the last couple of hours, the last 24 hours, rather supports that view. First of all, in terms of the situation on the battlefronts, it basically remains as always. There have been more Ukrainian attacks in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area on the southern front lines, south of Orechov, in the direction of Tokmak. The 71st Jaeger Brigade, which is the last brigade that Ukraine committed to the offensive, and which Ukraine, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, has taken out from its strategic reserve. Anyway, it was in action. It carried out more attacks towards Verbovoye. Apparently, those attacks were unsuccessful, and Russian commentators from the scene are suggesting that, in fact, the entire offensive in this area is now starting to run out of steam. I would say that there is a different view on the Russian side. There's been comment now from Yevgeny Belitsky, who says that the enemy, that is to say, the Ukrainians, are completing the redeployment of units in the Rabotino area. Then we expect an aggravation of the situation in Rabotino-Verbovoye. Belitsky did go on to say that Kiev should not expect success, as the morale of Ukrainian troops is now very low. And he went on to say further, this is all apparently in an interview he gave to TASS, he went on to say that Kiev's leaders are getting closer to the quarterly report time to their Western curators, and they're in need of victory, and the need for a short-term success, which will be presented as a big victory, will be paid by the lives of the recently mobilized soldiers. That's Belitsky's view. He is, of course, now the actual governor of the Russian-controlled area of Zaporozhye region. That's what he said, and that's the view he's conveyed about what the Ukrainian intentions are. I should say that other Russian commentators are more sanguine. They seem to think that it is unlikely that Ukraine, with the forces it has, can launch an effective offensive in this area. I am not, obviously, in a position to say one way or the other. I did read one comment, however, which I suspect is true, which is that the troops, the Ukrainian troops who find themselves in this salient, this area that they've carved out between Verbovoye and Rabotino, where the Russians dominate the heights and the Ukrainians are in the low ground beneath the heights, especially given, as I said, their failure to capture either Rabotino or Verbovoye. Anyway, one point that's been made is that such cover as the Ukrainians do have in this area has been provided by the wooded plantations that exist in this area. But of course, with autumn and winter coming, the leaves will fall, the foliage will become thinner, and these plantations won't provide the cover that they previously did. At which point, such cover as the Ukrainians have in this area of low ground will reduce, making them easier targets for the Russian artillery on the heights. That's to say, putting aside the question of, whether or not the situation turns muddy as well, which will, of course, make the position of the troops, the Ukrainian troops on the low ground, I would have thought, even more difficult. As I said in one of my recent programs, unless the Ukrainians are able to achieve a breakthrough in this area within the next few weeks, and time for this is now running very short. Unless they're able to do that, then it seems to me that there is a real potential for a debacle here, and that the prospects for Ukrainian troops being able to retain control of this area of open fields and forest plantations between the heights, between the villages of Verbovoye and Rabotino, must look very limited to me over the course of the autumn and the winter. Anyway, just saying. So that's the situation at the moment in the southern conflict zone. It is at least as bad everywhere else. It is as bad in Bakhmut, in the Vremivka salient area, where, as I've said previously, it looks as if the Russians are continuing to push forward. In the Bakhmut area, the Russians do seem to have, again, stabilized the situation, despite claims to the contrary. Klesheyevka and Andreevka are not under Ukrainian control. And of course, further north, the Russians continue to claim that they're making more advances in the area of Liman and the Oskol River and Kupiansk. But again, evidence is limited. And if there is advances in this area, they're very small and incremental. It doesn't look as if the Russians are embarking on any major strategic offensive in this area either. But anyway, that, it seems to me, is the overall situation on the battle lines at the moment. The Ukrainians are stuck. There is no sign of any major offensive. 3.5 months, it's actually more than half a month in addition, more than 3.5 months. 3.5 months of intense offensive action, huge losses in men and machines, has produced barely any discernible outcome, scarcely any change on the front lines. Now, I will say that President Zelensky, who is winding up his trip to the United States, according to the Daily Telegraph, says that he has a secret plan to capture 2 towns in the conflict area. He's identified one as Bakhmut. He says that he won't disclose the identity of the other, but it's a reasonable guess that the other is Tokmak. I can't see how anybody could describe these sort of plans as remotely secret. But anyway, for what it's worth, that is what he has said. Now, he's also said other things, and according to Senator Schumer, who he met in Washington, he has said straightforwardly that Ukraine will lose the war unless it is provided with further aid from the United States. Senate Majority Leader, I take this from the Hill, said the most important message Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered to lawmakers was that failure to deliver more US assistance would condemn Ukraine to a Russian takeover. There was a single sentence that summed it all up, and I'm quoting him verbatim. Mr. Zelensky said, "If we don't get the aid, we will lose the war." That's a quote from him. Schumer told reporters following a closed-door meeting with the Ukrainian president. And in fact, there is now a major battle underway in Congress about the aid to Ukraine. Zelensky still has his supporters in the United States and in Congress. In fact, he has a lot of supporters in the United States and in Congress, especially. And I understand that some of the Republicans, the Republican establishment led by Mitch McConnell, has been working overtime to try and persuade House Republicans to shift and to authorize the additional financial aid that President Biden wants Congress to authorize around $25 billion, by my understanding. And the point is that House Republicans are now digging in their heels. They're increasing. There's a group of them that is strongly opposing additional aid to Ukraine. They've told Speaker McCarthy that they're most unhappy with the way in which aid to Ukraine has been tacked on to other defense appropriations, and with the Senate, the Republican caucus in the House unwilling to agree to authorize aid to Ukraine, there is now a potential risk of the budget, the US budget, not being passed, and of a government shutdown on the 1st of October, starting from the 1st of October. Nobody, by the way, should be alarmed or take these threats of a shutdown overly seriously. Even if Congress fails to authorize appropriations, full appropriations by the 1st of October, money will be found, it always is, and Congress will find money, it always does, to keep the government ticking along after the 1st of October. Talk of a government shutdown on the 1st of October is intended to scare Republicans in the House by reminding them of the debacle that took place in the 1990s, when a previous Republican majority unitedly refused to authorize a budget, causing an actual government shutdown, which it is widely believed, or at least the accepted story is, that worked to the advantage of the then Democrat president, who was Bill Clinton. But it's most unlikely, in my opinion, that anything like that will happen this time. And it seems that Senator McConnell, who remains the titular or nominal head leader of the Republicans in the Senate, and who is, of course, the major keeper of the Senate's, of the Republicans' purse. He's the person who controls the purse strings. Anyway, he's had a meeting with Zelensky. He has made it clear that he continues to support Ukraine fully. He says that support for Ukraine is not an option, in effect, for the United States. It's not charity. It is essential for the position of the United States. And there are reports, incidentally, that he's also telling the White House that he thinks that the White House's tactics have not been particularly good in terms of this particular appropriation. And anyway, he's working overtime to try to get President Zelensky his money. And however, and in the meantime, Speaker McCarthy, who is running into his own problems, his own control of the Republican House caucus is tenuous. Apparently, he's suggested the obvious step of separating the appropriation for Ukraine from the larger appropriations for the government. In other words, make aid to Ukraine a standalone issue. The White House will, of course, resist that, because if that were indeed to happen, given the feeling of some Republicans in the House, it's more likely that funding might be stopped. I say might be stopped because my own personal view is that one way or the other, Congress is going to authorize extra funding for Ukraine. One way or the other, the White House will find extra funding for Ukraine. The problem is not one of funds. As I've said many times, the United States is always able to find funds to conduct its foreign adventures, and will continue to do so for so long as the dollar remains the world's reserve currency. The United States will be able to do that with the case of Ukraine. It's more, I think, now a symbolic battle. And the fact that there is so much opposition to appropriations for Ukraine amongst House Republicans is ultimately what matters, and shows that support for Ukraine, support for President Zelensky and his government is now starting to dim, and I suspect not just on the Republican side, but on the Democrat side as well. Incidentally, coming to that point and just saying very briefly, I think that in the case of Senator McConnell and the establishment Republicans in the Senate, from their point of view, obviously they strongly support the conflict in Ukraine. They are people who endorse the Neocon perspective on the conflict and indeed share the Neocon worldview. But I think for them, getting the House Republicans back in line is even more important on this and on any other issue, because of course what is at stake ultimately is control of the Republican Party. Anyway, I do not propose to divert more time in this program to internal American politics, domestic politics, including in relation to Ukraine, because as I said, I don't think this funding issue is quite as important as people believe, and I don't personally believe that Ukraine is going to fall because the United States is going to run out of funds. I think funds will be found one way or the other, and continued support for Ukraine will continue. Anyway, that's one thing I did want to say. So, in the meantime, it was confirmed yesterday that the Russian missile attack of the previous night was the biggest Russian missile attack for some time. Around 50 missiles were involved. According to Ukraine, they managed to shoot all of them down, but the reality is that significant damage does appear to have been done, and it's been confirmed that one of the targets was an energy complex, and it's been suggested that this attack might have been the commencement of a Russian missile offensive against Ukraine's energy system. Well, if so, that remains to be seen. The missiles did have many other targets, and I think it's in the Russians' interests to keep everyone guessing about what their intentions are. I've said myself that I believe the primary purpose of the Russian missile offensive last year against the energy system was not to knock out the energy system, but rather to deplete Ukraine's air defense system, in which it was largely successful. And we'll see what the Russians plan for this autumn and winter, and whether in fact it is their objective at some point to launch some kind of ground offensive as well. But one way or the other, we're going to have to wait and see. So that's the situation on the front lines, that's the situation at the war, that's the situation in terms of the domestic battle in the United States and President Zelensky's secret plan, which he's talked about publicly, to capture 2 towns. But he's actually admitting to Senator Schumer that things are really grave and that without American aid, further American aid, Ukraine will lose the war. Now, Zelensky had his meeting with President Biden. President Biden made a further announcement of aid for Ukraine. The announcement was for, I think, $375 million, which is a minimal amount compared to the aid that the United States has given in the past. It included cluster munitions and HIMARS missiles. HIMARS missiles now are in generally short supply. I discussed all that in the program I made yesterday when I read that article by Stephen Byers, which basically said that, in fact, the situation is becoming more difficult in terms of supplying these HIMARS missiles. And of course, the cluster munitions are being supplied because the United States is short of 155mm shells, and Taiwan is not getting the howitzers and shells that it's been promised. And of course, there are some people in the United States who believe that Taiwan ought to be getting the higher, the better, the greater support. But anyway, the fact is the offensive has not achieved its objectives, and it is unlikely to break through. And as I've discussed, many people are now saying that the United States should be seeking a settlement, a diplomatic settlement of the conflict, that there ought to be negotiations, not between the United States and Russia, but between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, the desired objective that the United States has is a conflict freeze. And I've explained that this is clearly the position, the idea that the Sullivan Blinken axis, if you want to call it that, within the United States government has, and it appears to be supported by the Pentagon. Now, yesterday, I also said that there is another faction in the United States. It's not a faction which is in the ascendant, but it is nonetheless a powerful faction, and that's the more hardline faction, the Nuland-Kagan faction, if you like, the more hardline neocons. And they, on the contrary, continue to oppose negotiations, and they want to find some way of continuing the war, and that remains their primary objective. Now, today, there's been an article in The Economist, which I take to be the magazine which most closely articulates the point of view of this particular group. Now, The Economist has been the most hardline magazine on almost any subject for as long as I can remember, going all the way back to the 1970s and 1980s. It takes a neocon position on pretty much every subject, and not just a neocon position, but the hardest line neocon position on practically any subject. And of course, it loathes, it absolutely detests President Putin of Russia. And I think it has played a significant role in creating the myth, or rather the legend, of President Putin as the source of all evil that has become so prevalent today in the West. But even The Economist, which, in my opinion, closely reflects the thinking of the Nuland, Kagan in Britain, Boris Johnson faction, just saying, and is now quietly acknowledging that Ukraine's offensive is failing, and they acknowledge the need for a plan B. And I think that this is now, even the hardline neocons, their perspective. And I think this is their alternative. This is the alternative view that they're coming up with. And it's a long article in The Economist, which has appeared today. It's behind a paywall, but I will read extracts from it. That is the view that it articulates. Note, by the way, that it is The Economist that Ukrainian generals and the Ukrainian President Zelensky, go to and give interviews when they feel that the pressure is on, or alternatively when they want to make clear that they need more in the way of funding. But anyway, this is what this article by The Economist says. It says Ukraine faces a long war A change of course is needed. Its backers should pray for a speedy victory, but plan for a long struggle. And then it goes on to say that the war in Ukraine has repeatedly confounded expectations. It is now doing so again. The counteroffensive that began in June was based on the hope that Ukrainian soldiers equipped with modern Western weapons and after training in Germany would recapture enough territory to put their leaders in a strong position at any subsequent negotiations. And what that basically means is in a strong position to demand Russian capitulation. And then The Economist makes the key admission that this plan is not working. Despite heroic efforts and breaches of Russian defences near Rabotino, I'm not going to argue this point again, Ukraine has liberated less than 0.25% of the territory that Russia occupied in June. Actually, it's less than that, because of course the Russians have regained control of a significant amount of territory in Kharkiv region in connection with their Oskol-Kupiansk offensive. But again, I'm not going to go over that. And then it goes on to say, The Economist goes on to say, the 1,000-kilometer front line has barely shifted. Ukraine's army could still make a breakthrough in the coming weeks, triggering the collapse of brittle Russian forces. I don't know why they think that Russian forces are brittle, but never mind. But on the evidence of the past 3 months, it would be a mistake to bank on that. So that is The Economist, the journal that, as I said, most accurately reflects the thinking of the toughest of all hardliners, the most tough-minded and most radical of all the neocons. It is admitting that the offensive has, to all intents and purposes, failed. And, of course, it won't acknowledge that this is a strategic defeat, but as I have already pointed out, that is what it is. It is a strategic defeat for Ukraine, for the West, and what we're talking about is a strategic victory for Russia. But then comes the point. Asking for a ceasefire or peace talks is pointless. That's what The Economist says. So we may have failed in our offensive, all that expensive machinery, all those brave men, they may have been sacrificed for nothing. But don't ask for a ceasefire. Don't engage in peace talks. And then it goes on to say this. Vladimir Putin shows no signs of wanting to negotiate, and even if he did, he could not be trusted to stick to a deal. Now, I have to say the last point really, for me, is astonishing, given that it's now clear that the Russians were trying to get the Minsk agreement implemented, that it was Ukraine that was refusing to implement the Minsk agreement, that the Western powers were going along with the fact that Ukraine was refusing to implement the Minsk agreement, that the Russians came to an agreement with Ukraine in Istanbul last year, and that it was the Ukrainians who reneged on that agreement, and that the Western powers, basically, especially Britain and the United States, it was the Western powers who told the Ukrainians not to go ahead with the Istanbul agreement. So saying that Putin cannot be trusted to stick to a deal after that kind of history is astonishing. But anyway, that's what The Economist says, and we can be certain that that's what Victoria Nuland and the others who think like her are busy arguing in the corridors in Washington and London and Brussels. And then they purport to read President Putin's mind, something that Western commentators incessantly do. they describe his intentions. Putin is waiting for the West to tire and hoping that Donald Trump is re-elected. The fact Mr. Trump needs war to underpin his domestic dictatorship. Any ceasefire would simply be a pause to rearm and get ready to attack again. If Ukrainians stop fighting, they could lose their country. So that's the mantra. The fact that Putin has actually come out and said that he doesn't think that even Trump's re-election is going to make any difference to the war or to US policy is another matter, but we don't worry about what Putin says. We know what he's thinking. We can read his mind in some way. But anyway, that then begs the question, if Ukraine cannot break through, if its offensive has failed, that negotiations are ruled out, we can't negotiate, we can't even consider a conflict freeze, that really isn't the option that we can ever contemplate, what then do we do? Well, there is then a suggestion both Ukraine and its Western supporters are coming to realize that this will be a grinding war of attrition. And they need to rethink Ukraine's military strategy and how its economy is run. Instead of aiming to win, the word win is in quotation marks, and then rebuild, the goal should be to ensure that Ukraine has the staying power to wage a long war and can thrive despite it. And we go on to read, the first recalibration is military. Ukraine's soldiers are exhausted. Interesting to see The Economist say that. Many of its finest have been killed. Well, Brian Beletic, amongst others, has been saying this for a long, long time, but The Economist has finally got there. Despite conscription, Ukraine lacks the manpower to sustain a permanent large-scale counter-offensive. Note that admission. Ukraine lacks the manpower to sustain a permanent large-scale counter-offensive. It can't go on the offensive. It can't sustain offensives. It lacks the manpower to do that. Again, listen to what Brian Beletic, Michael Vlachos, Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, Professor John Mearsheimer, yours truly, lots of others. We've been saying all of this, but now The Economist is also saying it. Ukraine needs to husband resources and to change the game. Now, it doesn't say exactly what that means, but it does give some clues. New tactics and technologies can take the fight to Russia. Ukraine's tech-savvy entrepreneurs are ramping up drone production. There's an admission that, in fact, the Russians are ramping up drone production even more. But anyway, the point is that there needs to be strikes, an offensive right across Russia with these drones and missiles. And it says that alongside this offensive capability, Ukraine needs to boost its resilience, as well as heavy weaponry. It needs help with maintenance to sustain a multi-year fight, humdrum repairs, reliable supplies of artillery and training. And more than anything, a long war requires better air defense. Now, as to all of the last, there's no explanation as to where the United States, the West, is going to find the shells, the surface-to-air missiles, those kind of things, to sustain this kind of defense, where it's going to find the capabilities to protect itself in this kind of fashion. But anyway, that's, as I've said many times, neocons never worry too much about resources. The grand plan is to go on the defence along the front lines, no longer try ground offensives anymore, but hit the Russians with missiles and drones, take the fight to Russia, throw off all caution to the winds, and advance an attack in that way. Even as I make this program, we see this new cunning strategy in operation. I've just been getting reports about a Ukrainian missile attack on Sevastopol. Apparently 6 Storm Shadow missiles were launched against Sevastopol together with fleets of drones. 5 of the Storm Shadows were shot down by Russian air defense. 1 got through and did a certain amount of damage, we're not told how much damage, to the historic building which used to, in the past and perhaps still today, houses the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, though I have no doubt at all that the Russians have elaborate command headquarters and bunkers which are located in other places, and that is the real operational command center of the Baltic Fleet, of the Black Sea Fleet. But anyway, never mind about that. And the Russians are also reporting that one serviceman who was in this building has apparently gone missing. Presumably he's wounded or dead. Anyway, we'll find out in due course. But anyway, here we see, if you like, this strategy coming into operation. Missile strikes, drone strikes against Russian positions, Russian bases, and in the meantime, Ukraine shifting to a policy of defense in the ground war, because that is the logical implication of all of this, but continuing with the missile drone offensive at the same time, seeking to wear the Russians down. Now, I can already see problems here. Now, the first thing to say is let's just deal with this missile strike on the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Now, this is a building, and of course, buildings, it's a historic building, apparently, it's been damaged, but one could say with confidence that this is not going to affect the operation of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. As I said, undoubtedly, given that the Russians know and have known for some time that Ukraine possesses these missiles and that some of them do get through, the Russians will have made sure that the real command center of the Black Sea Fleet is in a hardened position. It might not even be in Crimea, by the way. There's no logical reason why it must be. At the same time, in order to cause damage to this building, Ukraine has had to launch 6 Storm Shadow missiles. Now, I don't know how much each one of these missiles costs, but apparently they cost an awful lot. These missiles are no longer produced in Britain or France, and apparently the means to put them back into production no longer exists. And I don't know how many of these missiles have been supplied to Ukraine and how many the British and the French have held back. But I would say, simply as a trade-off, damage to a building, the potential killing of 1, perhaps more, but so far we know only 1 serviceman, a certain disruption to the Russian Black Sea Fleet's operations, is not a good use of these weapons. It is, in fact, a waste of these weapons. Ukraine is frittering away its limited stock of Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, of which it has only a finite number, on what look like theatrical demonstration attacks. This is another one of those pinprick attacks that I've been talking about. It's not going to change or alter in any way the outcome of the war. It's going to make headlines around the world. The British media in particular is going to enjoy writing pieces about this. Before I did this program, I read in the Daily Telegraph how Ukraine had inflicted a massive defeat on the Russian Navy without even having a navy, which is a ridiculous claim. But anyway, that is what, as I said, Ukraine is doing with these Storm Shadow missiles. It is not in any real or true sense affecting the operations of Russia's Black Sea Fleet or changing the direction or the nature of the war. In fact, what ought to be of greater concern to Ukraine is that it is becoming increasingly clear that the Russians are succeeding more and more in shooting an ever higher proportion of these Storm Shadow missiles down. And not only are Storm Shadow missiles in finite supply, but they're in finite supply and becoming less capable of penetrating Russian defenses. Every so often, one will get through, but as I've said, using 6 missiles to attack one building and having only one missile get through is a bad trade-off. It would be a bad trade-off in commercial terms. It is also a bad trade-off in military terms. And the same must apply to any great drone or Russian offensive that drone or missile offensive that Ukraine tries to launch against Russia. Russia is the biggest country in the world by far. It has vast hinterlands. It can relocate production wherever it wants within its enormous territory. It has industrial facilities in the Urals far beyond Ukraine's reach, in Siberia as well. Its major cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, all of those are beyond the reach of Ukrainian missiles. And of course, Ukrainian missiles trying to reach these great cities would have to pass hundreds of kilometers of Russian territory. They would be detected by Russian radars. And as we've seen, the Russian air defense system is increasingly effective at shooting them down. And the same applies to drones. Ukraine has been sending drones against Russian cities. The Economist talks to us at length about how the drones have been, the skillful Ukrainian entrepreneurs have been able to produce what are actually very crude and basic drones in order to carry out these attacks. Maybe the West can supply more advanced ones. I'll come to that in a moment. But the fact is, this is not going to be the kind of air offensive, missile offensive, drone offensive that Ukraine can launch against Russia that is capable of altering or changing in any significant way the direction of the war. So that's the first thing to say. So this is already a fundamental misunderstanding of how wars are fought and how this particular war is fought, especially against an enemy as tenacious and as technologically advanced and as powerful as Russia. That's the first thing. And I'm not even comparing, of course, these limited drone attacks and missile attacks that Ukraine can launch with the far more powerful missile and drone attacks that Russia is launching. Notice that Russia, over the past couple of hours, has carried out a massive missile and drone attack on Ukraine. And instead of hitting one building, all the indications are that they've hit many, and some of those buildings have been consequential. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing to say. That's the first flaw in this entire theory. But then, of course, we have this idea of creating, well, it's not quite clear because The Economist and the Economist doesn't spell it out, doesn't spell out what exactly it is that Ukraine must do if it is no longer going to launch offensives, ground offensives, which it now concedes are unsustainable. It doesn't explain what it's going to do on the battlefronts. But the implication is that it is going to go on the defensive. It's going to conduct a defensive strategy in the ground war. Try to hold the Russians back rather than attack the Russians. Now, that is an advance over what we have seen previously. I mean, various people, Brian Balektic, Douglas McGregor, Daniel Davis, Scott Ritter, Professor Mearsheimer, I myself, we all were doubtful that this offensive would be successful at the outset, and The Economist has now come round to that view. So it's, I suppose, an advance that they no longer think that offensives, ground offensives, can succeed. But of course, they're not saying what obviously follows from this, which is that Ukraine go onto the defense, that it actually adopts a defensive strategy. Now, Ukraine adopting a defensive strategy is what Beebe and Webb were advising it to do a whole month ago, way back in August, the start of August, in that article which appeared in Time magazine. They were saying that persisting with this offensive was going to exhaust the Ukrainian army, weaken it, and by the way, The Economist refers to Ukrainian troops now being exhausted, anyway, and many of the best troops now having been killed, exactly what Beebe and Webb said would happen if the offensive continued. Anyway, The Economist, the Neocons behind The Economist, are now adopting or saying they want Ukraine to adopt the strategy that Beebe and Webb were talking about way back in August. We've had weeks of offensive action since then. If Beebe and Webb's advice had been followed then, in that case, thousands of men, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who are now dead, wounded, and incapacitated might just possibly be alive and well and not sacrificed in an offensive which, as Beebe and Webb pointed out, it was already clear by that point was going to fail. So a tragically belated recognition of this truth. Even if the Neocons, The Economist, can't spell it out that Ukraine must go onto the defensive, even as it attempts to carry out this fruitless and pointless and hopeless drone and missile offensive. But of course, when Beebe and Webb wrote that article, in that article which they wrote, they suggested a two-pronged strategy for Ukraine. Create defense lines, go over to the defense, hold the Russians back, and buy time for negotiations. And of course, the second part of that advice, negotiate, is as important as the first. Go on the defensive. But of course, the Neocons, very grudgingly, very reluctantly, The Economist, very grudgingly, very reluctantly, now recommends that Ukraine adopt the first part of Beebe and Webb's advice, go on to the defense, but they reject outright the second, that Ukraine begin negotiations, try to find a solution, try to find a way out. For the Neocons, for The Economist, for the leadership in Ukraine, that is still taboo. It is something that they will not countenance. This despite the fact that if you go back to that Beeb and Webb article, it's absolutely clear that from Beeb's and Webb's point of view, going on to the defence is only part of an overall strategy to end the war through negotiations. So, there we are. Create a defence, since of course the Economist won't even admit to the fact that Ukraine must now go onto the defence, even though it accepts that it can't go on the offensive. Even despite that admission, that implicit admission, because it is never explicitly made, we no longer have any discussion, any debate about negotiations. Negotiations cannot happen. We will continue instead with this missile and drone offensive, whose fundamental problems, whose underlying weaknesses I have already identified, and which actually are completely obvious, and hope that this eventually brings the Russians to heel. And then, of course, we have what is arguably the most bizarre part of this article in The Economist of all, because, of course, they say that Ukraine mustn't just go on the defensive. They won't say that word, but that's what they mean. It mustn't just launch this hopeless drone and missile offensive against Russia. Even whilst it is doing all of these things, it must thrive. And that is the word that The Economist actually uses, that Ukraine needs to thrive. Thrive. And how is it going to thrive? Well, first of all, The Economist, again, for the first time, admits that the internal domestic situation in Ukraine is bad. Industry has collapsed, agriculture has collapsed, the economy has essentially collapsed. Doesn't again quite admit that, but if you read between the lines, that is what it's saying. It says that the entire financing of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military and all of that now depends entirely on the West. It says that this isn't really sustainable, that this is a form of Dutch disease, a strange form of Dutch disease. Dutch disease is the concept invented quite a long time ago based upon the experience of the Netherlands, or the alleged experience of the Netherlands, that the Netherlands had a powerful natural gas industry, and that meant that the Netherlands became reliant upon that natural gas industry, and it allowed its industries and its manufacturing to atrophy. Something completely untrue, by the way. It wasn't true of the Netherlands at all. But anyway, that's the story. That's what Dutch disease is supposed to be. And this is apparently a form of Dutch disease that Ukraine is suffering from, that they've become over-reliant upon all these financial subsidies from the West. And what Ukraine needs, therefore, is to build up its industries, to reindustrialize, to produce thriving businesses and industries, even whilst the war goes on, even whilst it remains on the defensive. And of course, the fact that Ukraine is constantly under attack from Russian missiles and Russian drones, well, there's a simple answer to this. I've touched on it already. What the West needs to do is to supply Ukraine with an unlimited number of air defense missiles and presumably F-16 fighter jets and such things in order to hold the Russians back. Now, again, this, as I said, is an absolute and complete fantasy. I've discussed many times in this program. Again, Brian Breletic has come up with the actual numbers. The West has never been particularly invested in air defense. It hasn't big production facilities for air defense systems. Its air defense systems are anyway less effective than the Russian ones are, and the ones that the Ukrainians started the war with. And there is no realistic way that the Western powers can create the kind of air defense system in Ukraine that this article is talking about. And as with everything else, with the ammunition and the artillery and the maintenance and all of these things, what The Economist is talking about here is fiction. It is absolute, it's science fiction. It cannot happen. There is no realistic possibility that it will happen. And it's ludicrous that it is even being discussed. The article, by the way, also suggests that the bill for this gigantic reconstruction of Ukraine, even as it continues to be in a state of war, well, that should be footed principally by the Europeans, not by the Americans. The Europeans have provided supposedly almost as many weapons as the Americans have done, which, by the way, is absolutely not the case. But the Europeans, it says, have provided most of the financing, which may be true, and they should continue to do so. So Europe, in recession, paying more for its energy, it's got to continue to, nonetheless, pay massive bills to keep Ukraine going in order to enable Ukraine to thrive. Now, I think this is a remotely realistic plan. I think any part of this is remotely realistic. If we go over to perhaps the most realistic part of it, Ukraine going onto the defensive, well, again, to go back to what Beebe Webb was saying, that really only works if Ukraine commences negotiations. However strong and elaborate Ukraine's defenses are, and any defenses now would have to be improvised in a rush, and I've seen many suggest that in fact and realistically, if you're talking about a defense line right across the whole of, right across the whole line of contact, then realistically that would require a withdrawal behind the Dnieper, to the west bank of the Dnieper, ceding 40% of Ukrainian territory and letting it fall under Russian control. Just saying. But anyway, even if you did that, if you didn't negotiate, if you didn't make some serious effort to find a way to end the war, sooner or later, Russian resources are such that they would overwhelm any such defense line. The cost of keeping such a defense line functioning would anyway drain Ukraine of resources and would be unsustainable economically and in terms of human resources in the long term. And of course, despite all these optimistic claims about, saturating Ukraine with air defense missiles from the West, which don't exist, the reality is that the Russians will continue pummeling away at Ukraine, attacking industrial facilities, attacking infrastructure, attacking ammunition dumps and warehouses. A war fought purely on the defensive might be more prolonged, but it would be, in the end, the outcome would be the same. There would still be a Ukrainian defeat. So no part of this article actually adds up. But I'm going to say that this is what I suspect the neocons are now arguing for. They're never very interested as I said, in the logic, the underlying theory behind, the underlying practice, rather, behind whatever proposals they come up with. What they anticipate that they can do is that they can use these plans as talking points to argue behind the scenes with those who call instead for an attempt to find a way out of this war through a diplomatic solution, through a negotiated solution. So when Samuel Charap says that a long war doesn't serve the interests of the United States and is dangerous for the United States and depletes resources for the United States, the neocons can come back, but we won't have to provide those resources because the Europeans will pay the bill and the Ukrainians will establish their own industries. When Beeb and Webb come and say that fighting is exhausting the Ukrainian military, they will say, but we can keep the Ukrainian military going indefinitely because it will go on the defensive and therefore it will become the Russians who are exhausted instead. When people suggest that negotiations with the Russians are the only way forward, the neocons, Victoria Nuland and people like that will say, but Putin cannot be trusted in negotiations. And we don't need to negotiate with him anyway because we have a war-winning strategy, this missile and drone war that we are going to launch against the Russians. And besides, always they will revert to the underlying premise that the Russian economy is a gas station, that Russia is just a gas station masquerading as a country, that if we keep the pressure up long enough, it's Russia that cannot sustain the attrition war and that we will eventually come out victorious. The neocons may not be very practically minded about grand strategy. They might not be practically minded at all about any of these things, but they are very skilled bureaucratic fighters. And what this plan does, and I have no doubt that the neocons are behind this plan, what this plan does is that it gives them the talking points they need in the bureaucratic conflicts that are now raging in Washington, which they're going to try and deploy against the advocates of negotiations. And can I quickly say that I have no doubt whatsoever that the Nuland-Kagan faction does indeed endorse this new plan, because in effect, Victoria Nuland, after her recent trip to Kiev, she's given a television interview, I've seen it, in which she also talks about the importance for Ukraine of being able to strike at all these targets in Russia. She's clearly already talking about the plan. And if we go back to another person, one of their favorite people, one suspects, in Kiev, Kirill Budanov, well, basically, again, he was floating this whole same project in that interview with The Economist. He also seemed to be talking about a war that would be waged until 2025, 2026. Budanov expects that the Russian economy will collapse and that the Russians will run out of weapons at around that point. Doesn't provide any evidence for that. Even The Economist admitted that the evidence for this is patchy. But anyway, that's what Budanov said. And you can see that he is also part of this thinking. He also talked up the idea of this drone strategy and of this industrial resurgence in Ukraine itself. Well, I spent a lot of time on this, but because we're going to be hearing more about this argument over the next few months. And we're going to also be hearing arguments that the West must continue to support Ukraine because failure to do so means that Ukraine will lose, and that would be a disaster for the West, which of course it would be, but it would also provide an incentive to China to intensify its alleged aggression in the Pacific. And all sorts of people are now saying this. Mitch McConnell is saying it. Annalena Baerbock is saying it. It's all about pushing back and resisting and fighting the Chinese. This project began as a project to split Russia from China, inflict a strategic defeat on Russia in Ukraine. That was what that West Mitchell was all about. So we haven't succeeded in splitting Russia from China. So now, of course, we mustn't, however, give up. We must keep going, because perhaps in 2025, 2026, if Budanov is to be believed, the Russians will finally break. And in the meantime, of course, if we do pull back, if Ukraine fails, then China will be incentivized in some way that it isn't already to take action in the Pacific. Again, one can unpick this whole line of argument. I'm not going to devote more time to doing that, but one can see what is going on. And again, the key point to make here is that this is more a talking point than a real rationale for the continued support for Ukraine. Anyway, this is where we are. This is the battle that is going to be waged over the next few months. There's going to be those who say that Ukraine must be supported to the end, that the war must continue there, that negotiations with Putin are impossible, and that if we persist, we will eventually prevail, and we have a strategy, a plan for doing so. We create some kind of fortress Ukraine, and we fight the Russians off. And that's what, as I said, this new plan seems to be. And we've had other articles. There's been an article by Robert Clark, for example, in the Daily Telegraph, which is perhaps also pointing to some of the problems. He says Europe is on the verge, this is the Robert Clark article in the Daily Telegraph, Europe is on the verge of surrendering Ukraine to Putin. And the article is mainly a discussion about Poland and discussing why Poland has now announced that it can no longer go on supplying weapons to Ukraine. And Robert Clark makes, actually, in this article, a rather insightful point. He says almost every commentator has linked Poland's decision with the ongoing dispute over the sale of cheap Ukrainian grain within the EU. While there is some truth to this version of events, the more relevant point is that Poland is running out of material to send. After Washington and London, Warsaw has been the biggest military donor since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. I should quickly say that Robert Clark here is wrong. Washington and London are not the biggest military donors to Ukraine. Washington and Berlin have been. But of course, saying that would not go down well with the Daily Telegraph's editors and perhaps its readership. But anyway, he then goes on to say Poland has already given virtually all of its legacy Soviet-era platforms and military vehicles, in addition to a sizable chunk of its more modern equipment, including over 60 of its Leopard 1 tanks and 24 Leopard 2s. The generosity is coming to an end, in part because the cupboard is now bare. Since the war began in February, Poland has had one eye firmly and nervously on the Suwalki Gap, the thin strip of land separating Poland, Belarus, and the Russian nuclear fleet in the Kaliningrad area. Warsaw has accordingly been keen to beef up its own defences and military, continuing the build-up that began after the invasion of Crimea, and Warsaw is unwilling to pledge to its new stocks to Kiev before it's even received them. Now, there's a lot here in this article which I don't agree with, but the point about the cupboard being bare is, of course, right, and it doesn't just apply to Poland, as, by the way, elsewhere in the article, Robert Clark sort of admits. It applies to Britain, it applies to Germany, it applies to a certain extent to France, and of course it applies to the United States. And what is so strange about that article in The Economist is that alongside it there is another article also in The Economist which says that the West is not in a position to supply Ukraine with weapon systems to the same level of generosity that it did in the first 2 years of the war, in 2022 and 2023. From this point on, Western aid to Ukraine is going to start to dwindle because stocks have become low and production capacities cannot keep up. Now, that is the reality. War, as so many people have been telling me and been saying on various programs, is ultimately about logistics. Amateurs, they say, talk tactics. Professionals talk logistics. The logistics in this war overwhelmingly favor Russia. Now, given that this is so widely acknowledged and widely understood, the great mystery for me about this whole debate is why there is a debate at all. Why we get these extraordinary, bizarre articles in places like The Economist. Why people like Victoria Nuland continue to be given a hearing. Why Mitch McConnell continues to lobby for President Zelensky, of all people, when the choice manifestly is between negotiations of a serious nature, and what is increasingly shaping up to be a major strategic defeat and a debacle. But that, it seems to me, is where this very ideological approach to foreign policy, which we have adopted in the West, and I say we in the West because it's not only in the United States, that we have brought ourselves to. We are becoming increasingly unrealistic in the things we say. Ursula von der Leyen has just made comments about the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima, and these were addressed to the people of that town, that city in Japan. And of course she was careful over the course of those comments not to mention that it was the United States that dropped the nuclear bomb that fell on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945. As many people have pointed out, when the commemorations of those events recently took place in Japan, all the public speakers, all the comments that were made at that time over the course of those commemorations were very careful to avoid any reference to the United States and the fact that it was the United States that actually dropped the nuclear bombs. This is, of course, despite the fact that in saying this, one is not making any kind of value judgment. The question of the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is much debated. The wisdom of doing it is much debated. The morality of doing it is much debated. But the fact that it happened, that it was the United States that did it, well, that's a fact. But apparently it's not one that it's appropriate any longer to acknowledge. But Ursula von der Leyen went further, because she didn't just avoid mentioning the United States. She started referencing Russia. And though she did not say that it was the Russians who dropped the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima, well, the way that she addressed the people of that city might just possibly have conveyed that impression to some people, though I can't imagine there are many people in Hiroshima who don't know the true facts. But beyond that, anyway, her references to Russia in her subsequent comments made it seem as if it was the Russians who were the great nuclear threat, and have always been so, even from that time. And we've had similar, very strange comments from Boris Johnson in Britain. He's given an interview, and of course he spoke about the Second World War, and again he managed to convey the impression that Britain and the Allied powers won the war. He didn't really want to talk about the Soviet Union, but he did talk about Ukraine. And again, some people might have come away from that interview with the impression that Ukraine had been the West's ally in that war, not the Soviet Union. Of course, Ukraine as an independent country at that time did not exist. And of course, Johnson says all this. He unquestionably knows the actual facts, because he has written a, if I have to say it, not very good biography of Winston Churchill, whom he likes to compare himself with. So we have historical revisionism at the highest level now, and we have, which is, again, obviously narrative driven, and we have this trap. We can't accept that there is now real danger of defeat in Ukraine. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has written a long piece warning Western policymakers that that is now a real possibility, that there's a chance that Ukraine might experience an Afghan-style collapse, and he's warning Western political leaders that they should strive to avoid that outcome by finding some means to ending the war, and at least prepare for it. But again, that's not something Western leaders are prepared to acknowledge. The most they can do is discuss a long war. The most they can do, some of them, is float the possibility of a freeze. But in the meantime, others who come forward with fantastic scenarios of the West winning a long war by building up Ukraine's industries, by providing Ukraine with surface-to-air missiles which don't exist, by creating great fortified lines which don't exist, by enabling Ukraine to thrive even whilst the war continues. People who spin these fables are listened to and taken seriously instead of, well, an understanding of the obvious, which is that there not only have to be negotiations, but negotiations which, as the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said, must take a meaningful form. They must be based on meaningful proposals, ones that the Russians at least can actually take seriously. Well, the fundamental problem with this kind of foreign policy thinking is that, of course, since it is based on fictions, it is going to collapse when it eventually collides with the facts. Now, let me repeat again, I don't know what the Russian plans are. I've sometimes speculated about them and have frequently, nearly always in fact, proved to be mistaken about what the Russians intend to do. But there is a massive Russian build-up underway. The Russians will soon be in a position where they can launch a big offensive against Ukraine. One way or the other, this war is going to end when the Russians choose, and with them dictating terms. Most of the world understands that Western policy is barren. People listened politely at the United Nations General Assembly to President Biden's incoherent and stumbling speech, laden way down with cliches and without offering anything of substance. They largely ignored President Zelensky's rather unpleasant speech, which was listened to by only around a third of the people in the conference hall. Everybody else apparently stayed away. Ukrainian media have tried to paper over that fact by showing pictures of the conference hall filled with people and given the impression that this happened even as President Zelensky was speaking. Apparently, I haven't seen this myself, my eyesight is not of the best, but apparently they slipped. Apparently, in creating this collage of Zelensky speaking to a full conference hall, they included President Zelensky himself, apparently listening to his own speech, sitting in the hall with the other delegates. So, the reality is, again, only around a third of the delegates were there. And Chancellor Scholz, leader of a country, Germany, now in recession, once the economic powerhouse of Europe, once very recently, when Chancellor Merkel was running affairs, managing affairs in Berlin, one of the most widely respected and admired countries around the world. I say that, I was never a fan of Angela Merkel, but that she had undoubted diplomatic skills, about that I have never questioned. Well, when he addressed the General Assembly, he spoke to an almost completely empty hall. Most of the world is not listening to the leaders of the West. Most of the world is making its own decisions. There was a particularly interesting speech from the President of Colombia, once the United States' most stalwart ally in Latin America. Even he was talking about the folly of Western policy, its attempt to get Latin America to supply weapons to Ukraine, and explaining why the Latin Americans will not do that. Most of the world can see how fantasy-based Western policy on Ukraine has become. They also understand the inherent fallacy of many of the arguments the West has pursued, given throughout the war. But it seems that in the West, we prefer instead to cling to these fables. In the meantime, the Ukrainians provide us with the theatre. Our leaders and our opinion writers need to keep us in this complacent slumber by launching 6 expensive missiles to damage a single building, however important that building may be, in Sevastopol. Well, some people, I would say, in the West do understand the truth. They are not just, well, many people, but even some people in positions of authority. I noticed that, I think it was David Ignatius, has now published another piece in which he says that General Milley, apparently, when he spoke to General Zelensky soon after the drone attack on the Kremlin that took place in the spring, and apparently he warned General Zelensky not to use American weapons in carrying out strikes like that deep into Russia. He said that he, Milley, and the United States did not want that kind of escalation. I can't help but think that the reason that story has appeared now is because someone, perhaps General Milley himself, are taking this opportunity to make clear that if there is a plan to launch missile and drone strikes deep into Russia, they are opposed to it, and they do not want to see American equipment used in any such reckless and pointless way. So I'm fairly sure this is Milley himself, by the way, acting to distance himself from this particular Newland plan. And of course, there'll be others as well who also warn of these follies. But in the meantime, discussion in the West continues as it has. One faction proposing a peace deal, which neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians will accept, and which from a Russian point of view makes no sense, a proposal to freeze the war, and which the Russians have publicly rejected, and the other faction coming up with fantasy plans about Fortress Ukraine, keeping the Russian hordes at bay and thriving even whilst it does so. I find it difficult to express in words my feelings of dejection about all of this. I've said already in previous programs that reality-based, sensible, rational, humane options to seek peace do exist, but we see instead the kind of discussions, the kind of conversations that Western leaders are having, are making. Well, there we are. We will see what the outcome is. We will see whether over the next couple of days the Ukrainians are able to get their offensive going one last time, as Belitsky is talking about, whether there will be a Ukrainian push towards the Surovikin line, whether they are able to break through to Tokmak. I hardly think so myself, but, well, who knows? And we'll see also what else takes place in Ukraine. I should say that there are now rumours, before I leave this programme, I should say that there are even rumours that General Zelensky, I was saying some time ago that General Zelensky might be the next on the block after Defence Minister Reznikov. The deputy defence ministers, including Hanna Maliar, have now all been sacked. It looks as if the knives are indeed out for General Zelensky. As I said, I think he's annoyed the United States at various levels, and apparently he's now under investigation for surrendering the south of Ukraine at the start of the war. It seems to me he's much more likely in trouble because he has failed to recapture the south of Ukraine over the course of this latest offensive. But never mind. Anyway, we will see whether he is indeed in trouble. But one way or the other, this is where my video today ends. And can I say once more, thank you once more. Let me remind you, you can find all of our programs, all our videos on our various platforms, including Locals and Rumble and also X, the former Twitter. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to check the like button, to press the like button, and to check your subscription to this channel.